Good evening, everyone. My name is Rosalie Manassian. I am the president of the Armenian Students Association at the University of Toronto, Scarborough campus. I'm a fourth-year student finishing my double major in political science and city studies. On the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for coming here today to this academic conference titled From Prevention to Justice. Tonight's conference is organized by the Armenian Genocide Centennial Committee of Canada, hosted by the Armenian Students Association of the University of Toronto, St. George, and Scarborough campuses, and co-sponsored by the Armin Karo Students Association, the Armenian Youth Federation of Canada, the Sarah Corning Center for Genocide Education, the Hillel of Greater Toronto, the Osgood International Law Society, the Syrian Chaldean Syriac Student Union, and the Sarah and Chaim Neuberger Holocaust Education Center. Before we continue on with our guest speakers, I'd like to introduce you to our conference moderator for tonight, Mr. Rupen Jambazian. Rupen Jambazian was born and raised in Toronto. He is a graduate of the University of Toronto, where he completed a double major in history and near Middle Eastern civilizations. He has served on the local and national executives of the Armenian Youth Federation of Canada and the Hamaskayan Armenian Cultural and Educational Society of Toronto.
On behalf of the Armenian Genocide Centennial Committee of Canada, as well as all co-sponsoring organizations, I would like to welcome you all to this conference this evening. My name is Rupen Jambazian, and I have the honor of introducing our distinguished speakers, as well as moderating tonight's conference. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. These words, often heard in such settings, were once spoken by a Spanish-American philosopher. While you've all likely heard this quote before, his words are crucial when discussing the issue of genocide. Although the term was not coined until the mid-20th century, acts of genocide have occurred all throughout history. In the 20th century alone, it has been estimated that more than 119 million have been killed because of genocidal acts. By consigning these events to the past, humanity, in general, has remained responsible for forgetting these acts and preventing their understanding. As a result, it has caused and aggravated its harmful reoccurrence. As compassionate human beings living in the 21st century, it is important for us to learn, to remember, to overcome denial, and to understand the deadly events that occurred in the past. Recognizing past events of genocide and understanding the reasons for their occurrence not only shows humanitarian compassion, but also increases knowledge that helps prevent similar events from ever happening again in the future. However, remembering is not enough. Today, as we prepare to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the Armenian Genocide, a genocide that would take the lives of 1.5 million innocent men, women, and children, we, Armenians and non-Armenians alike, come together in search of justice for the crime committed. During all cases of genocide, there is a guilty party and a party that has been wronged, as is the case for the Armenian Genocide. This near century later, it is important not to fall back upon reconciliation as a way to cope with an outcome that begs for justice to be served. We must measure our optimism with our pragmatism and concur that though our ultimate redemptive goals may not be accomplished immediately, but with our constant and common determination, it will be accomplished nonetheless. Tonight's conference is entitled Prevention to Justice, for the sole reason that one is not possible without the other. In order for future genocides not to occur, it is vital for real justice to prevail. Therefore, it is our duty to always fight for what is true, not only as genocide survivors or descendants of genocide survivors, not as Armenians, Rwandans, Jews, Yazidis, or any other persecuted people that have been victims of genocide or genocide denial, but as human beings. It is our duty to fight for what is true and just, not only to remember our fallen ancestors, not only because it's the right thing to do. We must remember and continue to fight for justice because genocides continue to occur every day. And it is in our hands to make sure that the world does remember the past, so that we will not be condemned to ever repeat it again. Thank you. At this time, we will hear from the representatives of 3 organizations: the Sarah Corning Center for Genocide Education, Hillel, and the Yazidi Human Rights Organization International. Tanya, Mirza, and Rafi will share their experiences of how genocide and genocide denial have impacted their lives. Tanya was born in Russia, grew up in Israel, and moved to Canada at the age of 12. She is a graduate of York University, where she studied human resource management. She is the engagement coordinator for the emerging campuses in the GTA for Hillel Greater Toronto. In her capacity, she helps build Jewish students' communities and helps students discover their Jewish identity. Welcome, Tanya.
Hi, as was mentioned, my name is Tanya and I work for Hillel Greater Toronto. And it's an organization that works with Jewish students on campus. But it's also important for us to build partnerships and to build strong communities that will stand with us when the moment comes. I'm here today because our communities have a common goal: to bring truth to light and to preserve the history of our people. We're defined by our histories, and when people still seek to bury it and deny the truth, there is no greater weapon than standing united for the undeniable truth. To be honest, I knew nothing of the Armenian genocide when I started working in Hillel this past November. And in my first week or 2, I was invited to come to Scarborough campus and listen to a talk given by Rafi Sarkisian, which is sitting right here, who spoke about justice and the importance of it to families and descendants who are still 100 years later fighting to get recognition of their history. I was already passionate about Holocaust education, but the Armenian narrative, which the Holocaust mirrors almost to a T, truly affected me. We are people with a shared history and a shared pain, but we're still here, and this history places our responsibility on our shoulders. Not only must we advocate for the truth, whether it takes 10 years, 100 years, or 100 more, we must also fight and advocate for those sharing our histories today. When we say never again, we mean it. And never again encompasses in itself the prevention of such actions taken against ourselves and others again. I know that we can't stop the pain and these actions happening in the world today, but united, we can come close, and closer still when more voices join our own. We're definitely going to stand together and make sure every story is heard and every truth is remembered. I just want to say that the Azrieli Foundation, which donated generously Holocaust memoir, is available at the front, and it's for free. We have quite a few copies, so feel free to take. And I just want to say that in my own experience, my family didn't grow up in Poland, but we grew up in Russia. And I have maybe 20 family members right now that are still left alive. Like, that is my family, 20 people. I know that there's people out there with 40 cousins, and they don't even know half of them, and that makes me really jealous. I know that it was not the same story, but I share the same history, because people in my family have perished under a regime that destroyed them and killed them just because they were Jewish and just because they had the courage to stand up. But I think that despite everything, that's what we must do. We must stand up. And as a representative of the Jewish community, I think it's important for a community like ours to come together and speak the truth. Thank you for having me.
Sheikh Mirza Ismail is a native-born Yazidi who was forced to flee Iraq under Saddam Hussein's regime in 1991. Spending over 2 years as a refugee in Syria and Turkey, Sheikh Mirza made his way to Canada, where he received a degree in social service work in 2010. As a Sheikh, Mirza Ismail holds a position of leadership among the Yazidi people and is the chairman and founder of Yazidi Human Rights Organization International. Sheikh Mirza Ismail is a frequent speaker on Yazidi religion, culture, and history. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the Armenian community for inviting us here to this important event. As a Yazidis and Armenia, Jews, Zoroastrian, Hindus, we have a shared history together, a sad history together that has been written with tears and blood. When we say never again, we mean it never again, but unfortunately, never again repeats again and again, which is so sad to see in the 21st century, again by those Islamic extremists and radicals that are taking innocent lives by hundreds and thousands of innocent people almost on a daily basis, especially in the Middle Eastern region. However, we now have more Islamic extremist groups such as the Islamic State, also known as ISIS, Hamas group, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and other Islamic extremist groups that have committed crimes against humanity and human rights against innocent and religious minorities such as the Yazidis, Jews, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, Baha'i, Zoroastrian, etc. Just because we are different in faith and we have different way of life, who want to enjoy their life in peace and freedom. But unfortunately, they don't let us to have our freedom. Muslims says or say, Islam is the religion of peace. But where's the peace? Is the peace that means killing people, beheading people, raping 7, 8 years old girls, selling girls and children in a market as sex slaves, training 10-year-old boy to be jihadist, converting other by force to Islam? Is this peace? I don't think so. You may be aware of the crimes that are taking place against the Yazidis and Assyrians in northern Iraq. There are currently more than 430,000 displaced Yazidis living in tent camps in northern Iraq. More than 10,000 Yazidis were killed, including beheading and passing away of starvation and dehydration. Yazidi men and children in front of their mother's eye. When Yazidi region was run over by the ISIS on August 3rd, according to abducted women that I met in northern Iraq, they claim that 7,450 Yazidis, mostly young women, young married women, teenage, and girls, and their children were abducted by Islamic State. In all respect, it's a genocide campaign that began August 3rd, 2014. But unfortunately, we have not seen the world stood up and tell the truth. Historically, the Yazidis have been exposed to policies of expulsion and assimilation. That's why we fled to mountains, then immigrated to European countries in the last centuries. We Yazidi then followed by other Yazidis from Syria and finally from Iraq. As a result of the Iraqi bad government policy, which aimed to replace the Yazidis with Arab Muslim on the Yazidis' farmland, we were driven from our Yazidis' homes, shops, and farm. This campaign severely affected the social and economical Yazidi situation under the Ba'ath regimes. Ethnic cleansing of Yazidis' land was largely ignored. Since 1991, when the Iraqi Kurdish region began enjoying their own autonomies, and since the 2003, after the fall of previous dictatorial Ba'ath regime, the Kurdish question has overshadowed our people. The fact that the Kurds have been trying to assimilate the Yazidi into Kurdish identity. In other words, the Kurdistan regional government has taken over Saddam's unfinished work. Where's our cultural rights? We ask the United Nations and all other members of the international community to put pressure on the Middle Eastern government to respect our identity, to respect our religious rights, to respect our cultural rights. Some may ask, other groups in the Nineveh Plain, how did they cope with the ISIS invasion? Sadly, many have joined the ISIS, such as the Sunnis, the local Arab, the Kurds, the Turkmen, quickly joined ISIS and killed their own Yazidi neighbor in Sinjar. A further note to our neighbors, our long battle fight in the Kurds has been betrayed in dozens of new ways. Since the arrival of ISIS, first the Kurds abandoned every Yazidis they were allegedly protecting, and in some ways at least they had advance notice of the ISIS offensive against the Yazidis. Second, they have refused to support the Yazidis' effort to defend themselves. And most notably, there are reports Kurdish Peshmerga killing 9 Yazidi men as they fled the battlefield. But at the same time, the PKK group and Kurds from Syria, they came to Sinjar and they fight against ISIS and they protected many Yazidis. So now I ask all of you, especially those who have faced a genocide, like the Jewish, Armenian, Yazidi, Hindu, Zoroastrian, to stand together and work hard until the world comes up and recognizes the truth. It's a genocide and must be recognized as a genocide. Thank you so much.
Rafi Sarkisian is an educator and a human rights advocate. He is the vice principal of the ARS Armenian Private School, an instructor at Centennial College, and the chair of the Sarah Corning Center for Genocide Education. He holds a BA in History, a Bachelor of Education, and a Master's of Education from York University. Welcome, Rafi.
Good evening. I am honored to share my voice with you today as a descendant of survivors of the Armenian Genocide. 100 years have passed since the crime, yet it continues to adversely affect generations subsequent to those who physically experienced the destruction. Genocide is a crime that transcends time and space. Genocide is not constrained to a particular time period, nor are its consequences constrained within a particular boundary. As a systematic attempt to destroy a group, genocide aims to destroy beyond the physical and material, destroying the non-material as well. This leaves further lasting consequences for those who survive and their descendants. The legacies of genocide are like haunting echoes from the past, reverberations and aftershocks. The legacies for Armenians are a destroyed and occupied homeland and a bare family tree, vanished dialects, and the destruction of knowledge, traditions, monuments, and cultural practices once tied to the land, now lost, and the loss of Armenians' birthright to a cycle of life, peace, prosperity, growth, and legacy in Western Armenia. Today, the Armenian genocide is caught in the last stage of genocide, denial. The Turkish government's state-level denial has long taken aim to finish the work started by the CUP triumvirate 100 years ago. It today echoes the goals of Mehmet Talat, who in June 1915, in conversation with Dr. Mortman of the German embassy, said, "What on earth do you want? The question is settled. There are no more Armenians." This state-level denial, fueled by justice aversion and international impunity, victimizes both Armenians and Turks. In Turkey's denial, we see a missed opportunity for social transformation in genocide education. Sites of memory from the Armenian genocide that should have become sites of education and about human suffering have instead been destroyed or not treated as such. Family stories of Turkish upstanders and heroes who saved Armenians' lives remained and continue to remain hidden due to fear of persecution. And today, the voice of Turkish intellectuals who strive to effect change in the country are stifled. For example, in 2010, a Turkish lawyer, Bendal Celil Ezman, submitted a claim to an Ankara court demanding recognition of the Armenian genocide, to condemn its mastermind Mehmet Talat, and rename all the streets that have been named in his honor. Today, there are close to 60 public places named after Mehmet Talat. A case was filed against Ezman under Article 301 of the Turkish Penal Code, accusing him of having offended the Turkish nation, slandering of state bodies, and for actions that conflicted with professional lawyers' duties. Imagine a Germany where Hitler is a hero and the memory of Oskar Schindler in oblivion. Turkey continues to lionize the architects of genocide, while the story of brave Turks who saved Armenians' lives withers in the country's overbearing silence and oppression. The destructiveness of genocide denial, coupled with the passing of the generation that survived, has made it a challenge to remember the past. But Armenians continue to survive, remember, and demand. Time does not heal wounds. Justice does. Time also cannot hide the truth. Truth does not expire. Justice for the Armenian genocide is justice for humanity as a whole. Recognition and reparations for the Armenian genocide is to endow a better world for all and to ensure that the international community is genuinely committed to the punishment and prevention of genocide. In our province of Ontario, genocide education plays a vital role in defeating the crime of genocide and its antecedents. Therefore, it is imperative that we educate to end discrimination, educate to fight denial, educate to defend human rights, and educate to create a world where we can appreciate and respect differences and live in peace. Thank you.
And now we will hear from our distinguished guest lecturers. Dr. Fatma Göçek is a professor of sociology and women's studies. Her research focuses on the comparative analysis of history, politics, and gender in the first and third worlds. She critically analyzes the impact of processes such as development, nationalism, religious movements, and collective violence on minorities. Her published works include East Encounters West, France and the Ottoman Empire in the 18th Century, published by Oxford University Press in 1987, Reconstructing Gender in the Middle East, Tradition, Identity, Power, published by Columbia University Press in 1994, Rise of the Bourgeoisie, Demise of an Empire, Ottoman Westernization and Social Change, published by Oxford University Press in 1996, A Question of Genocide, Armenians and Turks at the End of the Ottoman Empire, published by Oxford University Press in 2011, and many, many more. I had the pleasure of hearing Professor Göçek speak at this very university 10 years ago, when she delivered a lecture entitled Turkey, the European Union, and the Armenian Question. My good friend Daron Keskian and I were high school students at the time, and were responsible for writing a short article on the lecture for the school paper. I remember that very well. I also remember how mind-blowing it was for us at the time to be listening to a Turkish-born historical sociologist speaking about the Armenian genocide. Her fearlessness inspired us 10 years ago, and it continues to inspire us today. Dr. Göçek's talk is entitled Denial of Violence, Ottoman Past, Turkish Present, and Collective Violence Against the Armenians, 1789 to 2009. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Fatma Göçek.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and it's a great pleasure and honor to be back here 10 years later. I do remember it was again a packed audience, and it was at the time for me the beginning of a long process, and one that is still going on, of course, but the major difference probably is that from then until now, I've published definitely 3 books that deal with the genocide. The last one actually is the one that's the title of my talk, which just came out of Oxford University Press in November 2014. And it's called Denial of Violence. And that's where I deal with the whole issue of denial, which is so important, obviously, to what we're talking about today. So what I thought I would do, undertake in this talk, is to talk to you about why denial is so significant, and also to underline the fact that denial is not only devastating for the victims, but it is also extremely destructive for the perpetrators as well. And that it was actually the starting point of what turned out to be a book that took me 12 years to write. And I want to sort of share with you how I came to write that book and why I think this is an important issue for all of us and for the benefit of humanity as a whole. Many people argue that denial is the last stage of the genocide, because what denial does is that it inhibits people from acknowledging what happened so as to start the healing process. If you deny, the wounds stay open and the wounds continue to the present. One cannot heal. When one cannot heal, one cannot move on with life. When one cannot heal, one loses one's hope in humanity. They no longer trust each other, humankind. And those are the very destructive consequences of denial. In terms of the Armenian genocide, what has been the most significant impact of denial is that whenever I talk to Armenians, mostly in the diaspora or in Turkey, the way they talk about 1915 is as if it happened yesterday, not 100 years ago. And that immediacy demonstrates that emotionally the lack of acknowledgement does not allow the healing to occur. And in a way, unfortunately, because of denial, they are trapped by the past and they cannot move forward. And the people who are most upset about this are the younger generations, of course, because they still have to bear this unbearable weight about which they do not know what to do. And it is observing that made me realize how important it is for the acknowledgement to come through. Before I turn on to explain why denial is also extremely destructive for the perpetrators, let me say that given how much I have observed and understood the impact the lack of acknowledgement has had on the Armenians throughout the world, I personally, as an ethnic Turk, apologize for all the pain and suffering that has been caused on the Armenian people. I am sorry. sorry for what happened. I'm sorry that we lost the chance to have a future together, to have a present together, to have a past together. When I see how much we share, it is an incredible loss for Turkey not to have the Armenians as a part of their body politic. It's a loss that has not only persisted, but even become more destructive over the years. And from that point of view, I follow what Hannah Arendt has said in the context of the Holocaust. I am not guilty for what happened because I was not personally involved in it, but I am nevertheless responsible. I am responsible as a human being, as a scholar, and as a Turkish citizen to seek justice and to make sure that there is justice delivered in terms of this. And the way I can do that as an academic, as a scholar, is basically to work on this and to share with the world what I find. And that is what I've been trying to do in the last decade or so. When you look at the perpetrators, why is 1950, I mean, what happened in the past, why is the genocide so destructive at the same time? What happens, of course, in that case is that there is a violence that the perpetrators get away with. So that, you know, what happens is that as a consequence, that violence becomes normalized and naturalized in their lives. And what happens is that they lose their moral compass. They are no longer able to also trust in humanity because they think brute force is the way to get what they want in life. And that also reduces and impoverishes their lives. And the major consequence of that, I think, in the case of Turkey, is that they are unable to tolerate difference and they are unable to have a truly democratic society. And it was especially my observations of the latter, being born and raised in Turkey, that led me to understand the origins of this violence and how the lack of accountability for what happened, the lack of acknowledgement impacts Turkey today just as much as it did in the past, in the sense that they are unable to move forward and to create for themselves and for others a world that acknowledges difference and that promotes peaceful living among many different populations. And that is what at least I aspire to provide the groundwork academically through my own studies. And that is why I think it is important for the perpetrators. And what is fascinating is that just as the victims cannot stop remembering because of the wounds that are not healed, the perpetrators try extremely hard to forget all the time, and they do not want to refer at all to what happens in the past. But of course, that is not possible either, because it keeps coming up in the form of violence in various forms. And that is, I think, the major problem and issue that one has with such collective violence embedded in one's past. In that context, then, how does one go about studying denial? To me, from the beginning, what was the issue was not whether a genocide happened or not. I mean, it was evident to me that it had, whichever way you looked at it. Because, just to put it very bluntly, if you look at the population of the Ottoman Empire around 1897, Armenians comprise about 20%. Today in Turkey, there are about 0.04% Armenians. Had there not been a genocide, there would have been about 20 million Armenians in Turkey today, and they're not. That in and of itself demonstrates that there was a severe violence that occurred. Not only did it occur, interestingly enough, during like 1915 to 17 or 22, whichever way you approach it, But I think it has continued since then as well, because at the beginning of the Turkish Republic in 1923, there were 200,000 Armenians. And if they had all stayed in Turkey, there would have been many more Armenians in Turkey today than there are at the moment. So obviously, the policies continued in one way or another of collective violence. That is why I changed the way I approached it. And didn't only focus on the genocidal period. Another reason for this is that I could not for the life of me understand, as a citizen of the Turkish Republic, why Turkish state and government officials didn't say, this is something that happened in the Ottoman Empire and we're the Turkish Republic and therefore will acknowledge and move on. That is what I could not understand. I mean, to me, this is something that happened in the past, but why is it that the Turkish state and society still deny what happened to the state? That, for me, was the most important question. When I approached this question, I looked to see what were the major instances of collective violence committed against the Armenians. And in addition to 1915-17, there was also significant massacres against the Armenians in 1894 to 96 during the reign of Sultan Abdülhamid II, where about 100 to 300,000 Armenians perished. So obviously I said the violence predated the genocide. And did the violence cease after the genocide? Well, that wasn't the case either, because there were similar massacres between 1919 and 1923 during the Independence War. And after 1923, there were also other instances of collective violence, albeit not to the same degree, that happened during the course of the Turkish Republic. The most significant of those being the 6-7 September 1955 events, when there were pogroms against the non-Muslim communities in especially major cities of the Republic, that led to the destruction of not only many non-Muslim sites, but also the rape, plunder, and death of a couple of dozen people. Also significant in this context were later collective violence that was the later collective violence that occurred, and I think the most significant instance is the 19th December 2007 assassination of a journalist of Armenian origin in Turkey, Hrant Dink, who happened to be a very good friend and colleague. And I think that assassination, in addition to other instances of violence committed against non-Muslims in Turkey, demonstrate that this is an ongoing process. As the speaker before me said, it obviously is not contained, not only the violence, but its consequences are with us through the generations. And that is why I start very early on in 1789 and come all the way to 2009. And the main argument I make in the book is that what we see is a layering of denials throughout Turkish history. It's that layering that makes it increasingly difficult for Turkish state and society to come to terms with what happened. And the way I studied it is that I decided to start in 1789, not because it is the year of this French Revolution, although that was also very important, but it's the year that Sultan Selim III came to the throne in the Ottoman Empire. And it was Selim that started systematic modernization of the empire. What I argue in my book is that modernization, the whole process of modernity, polarizes communities in a way that there is a lot of tension that starts building up because of the modernization process. And what is very important then is how that polarization gets triggered because of the public expression of emotions, a trigger that leads to violence against Armenians, then you would ask, well, if there is violence, why doesn't acknowledgement follow? And this is also something that is hard to understand. Why was it that, there was such mass destruction? Why didn't Ottoman or later Turkish society acknowledge what happened? And there I look at, for my analysis, not public government or state documents, but I looked at memoirs to understand why was it that people failed to acknowledge what happened. I read about 700 or 800 memoirs, which was fun, but long. And I basically tried to read all the memoirs that were published in Turkey, in Turkish, in the Latin script after the 1928 alphabet script revolution, because these memoirs technically had information on minorities and violence. This information was available to Ottoman and later Turkish society, and in spite of this information, people still denied. So that is why I was looking at these memoirs. There were about 300 of them that I used. I had about 1,000 pages, single-spaced of notes and quotations I had from these memoirs. And what is most interesting is that nobody in their right mind, of course, had read so many memoirs. And among these, about 85% belonged to Turkish officials and officers. So I, in the process, read the memoirs of those who actually were perpetrators themselves. And that is what makes it so interesting, because it demonstrates how these, in these memoirs, people pick upon certain events that happened at the time to not acknowledge but to deny what happened. And what my argument is, it's a very complicated argument and a very long one. The book itself is 644 pages, so it is not for the weak of heart. Hopefully one reads through it, at least that's what people who like me tell me, but I don't know about the rest. But what is so interesting about it is that at the very beginning, what happens in what I call the Hamidian or the imperial period, that goes from 1789 to 1907, is you have the denial, first denial, is the denial of the origins of the Armenian issue. And that first denial basically argues that even though the origins of the issue is a domestic one, the official Ottoman narrative that emerges poses it as if it were instigated by the great powers, as if the Armenians were the puppets, so to speak, of the great powers. They were not. The actual reason the Armenian issue emerged is because of the failure of the reforms that the Ottoman sultans undertook in 1839, 56, and 76. There was a lot of inequality among especially the Muslims and the non-Muslims that these reforms were supposed to overcome, and they never did. The ones who suffered the consequences of these the most were the Armenians living in eastern Anatolia that tilled the soil. They were the ones who ended up losing a lot of their soil and their property and things to Muslims. And that is the first one. Rather than the Sultan acknowledging his shortcomings of the whole system, he instead blamed it on the great powers and said that they were the ones who instigated it. So I call this first denial of origins, because it is denial of the origins of the issue. The second one, I have 4 phases, so I'm almost there. The second phase is the phase from 1908 to 1918. This is the Young Turk phase, when most severe destruction occurs. If you look at this phase, what is most significant about it is that these were people who were mostly, that is the CUP people, were Committee of Union and Progress people were mostly educated in the West or in Western-style schools. Many of them, including Dr. Nazım and Dr. Bahattin Shakir, as the name indicates, were actually, and Dr. Mehmet Şahingiray, were actually doctors, physicians, who should have saved lives rather than destroyed them. But in a way, it was this modernity, this idea of excising from the body politic parts that were so-called not healthy, that led them to undertake such violent crimes. And what is very important in that context is the second denial. And the second denial is denial of the act. Even though the deportations that were taken were said to be taken for military reasons, to remove the people from the frontier, the military frontier, the intent was denied. The intent was the destruction of the Armenians, of the Ottoman Empire. And that destruction often occurred outside of the cities, where there were not many people who were there who could have witnessed what happened. It was usually the males and male children up to the more than the age of 12 that were destroyed, massacred immediately. The women, children, and the elderly then were taken on these very circuitous routes, during which they either perished or they were taken in by the local families. People argue that there are about 2.5 million Islamicized Armenians in Turkey today, and many of them are only recently discovering their roots. What is very important then in this stage is that even though the intent all along was the destruction, because the Armenians, after all, had Armenia as their ancestral lands and had been there before everyone else, it was the Young Turks who decided that the same lands ought to be the homeland of the Turks, and that is basically what led to this incredible destruction. And I call that the denial of the act. So even though the act is to destroy, it is not posed as such. Then we move on to the third denial. And this is, of course, the most crucial one, because it brings us into the Turkish Republic. When you look at, and this is also goes back to my question on why on earth don't the Turkish state and society acknowledge what happened. Well, the problem is, this is the stage which I term the denial of the perpetrators. Basically, what happened is that as the Ottoman Empire lost the First World War, and as the British and French and Italians who came in, but mainly the British, decided to hold military tribunals and try many of the leading Young Turks for the crimes they committed. A lot of them, some were caught, but a lot of them escaped either to the mountains, or they unfortunately went and joined Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who had started the independence movement. So they threw in their lot with this new independence movement. And with the, of course, victory of the independence movement, what happened was that the former perpetrators became the new heroes of the Turkish Republic. And this is what is so important in understanding why there is no acknowledgement, because what happens is that the former perpetrators then whitewashed their past and recreated their persona. So not only were they not punished for what happened, they were actually rewarded, and they became very significant rulers, especially in the Turkish Republic. A very good example of this is İsmet İnönü, who is the second prime minister after Mustafa Kemal, as well as the second president later on of the Turkish Republic, in addition to holding other very important positions. He also later on is the most significant instigator of the massacres of the Kurds, by the way, which demonstrates the continuation of the violence. But he himself was the leader of the Teşkilat-ül Mahsusa, the special organization, and also very much involved in overseeing these informal, so to speak, massacres carried on mostly by militia. So what we see and what I term the third denial is the denial of, therefore, the perpetrators. So we have the origins actors, and the final one is the last one that starts in 1974 and comes up to this day, and that is called the denial of responsibility. That's what I call it. Why? What happens is that in 1974, as I'm sure you know, there are it's the beginning of the attacks against Turkish diplomats. There are about 38 in all who are killed and assassinated between 74 and 85. And when that is happening, it's the Justice Commandos of the Armenian Genocide as well as the Armenian Secret Army for the Liberation of Armenia, Asala. I mean, so their actions immediately provide a lot of shock in Turkey, and because they do not know where these people are coming from. Obviously, the terrorists themselves try to get attention to what has happened and want acknowledgement. In the first case, Yanukyan assassinates the LA Consul General and the Deputy Consul General, and the US public prosecutor sends a message to the Turkish Foreign Ministry saying, I want some information on what your official stand on this issue is. The year is 1974. At the Foreign Ministry in Turkey, they look, and the only thing they can find on the Armenian issue in English is like this 4-page brochure. They have nothing on it because they have decided themselves that this has been finished, the issue is gone. So suddenly they need some information. Interestingly enough, what do? According to Kamran Gürün's memoirs, since I have so many memoirs, they sent from Ankara, they send a letter to all the scholars, academics in all of the history, I guess, professors throughout Turkey. They invite them to a meeting in Ankara. And then they say to them, we want you to write a history that demonstrates how the violent Armenians today were also violent in the past, so that is what you should be doing. And Gürün writes in his memoirs, these scholars, he says, were so uppity, they refused to do what we told them, and they had the chutzpah to even tell us what we should be doing instead, and like doing academic work, right? So they were sent back to their universities in disgrace. And because they needed some material, what did they do? They basically mobilized all the retired diplomats and put them into the archives. And the diplomats, being state officials then, of course, told history as it should be told, where they knew the answers before even doing the research. And what happened as a consequence is they went through and basically tried to document each and every person that was or maybe allegedly killed by an Armenian throughout Ottoman and Turkish history. And that is how you came up with this whole mutual massacres sort of trope. Because and that is what I call the denial of responsibility. They did not use this occasion to actually acknowledge those who died. Instead, they denied even, according to some counts, there were more Armenians, there were more deaths that Armenian caused than Armenians could possibly undertake. I mean, so they're like supposed to be 1.5 to 2 million Turkish deaths. And, when that's usually the number of people, Armenians that are massacred, and they include women, children, and the elderly. So, there's no way they could have killed so many Armenians. But at that point, it no longer becomes an academic issue. It becomes a rhetorical thing, and it becomes a political, basically, reshaping of what happens in the past. And this is why it is extremely difficult, and I'll end with this, to actually listen or abide by calls, especially of the Turkish state and its representatives, that we should leave it to the historians. Well, it depends on who those historians are and who will be chosen to represent and judge, so to speak, what happened. But I hope with time, as is indicative here too and elsewhere, there are more and more Turkish scholars of Turkey who are aware of what's happening and who are willing to stand up so that we could have a future together again in the, and one where we live in peace together. So I thank you.
Dr. Henry Theriault is currently professor in and chair of the philosophy department at Worcester State University in the United States, where he has taught since 1998. From 1999 to 2007, Dr. Theriault coordinated the university's Center for the Study of Human Rights. He earned his bachelor's in English from Princeton University and his PhD in philosophy from the University of Massachusetts, with a specialization in social and political philosophy. His research focuses on reparations, victim-perpetrator relations, genocide denial, genocide prevention, and mass violence against women and girls. He has lectured and given panel papers around the world, including Armenia, Turkey, the mountainous Gharapal Republic, Lebanon, Australia, Japan, South Korea, Rwanda, Britain, France, Belgium, Italy, Argentina, and across the United States. He is founding co-editor of the peer-reviewed Genocide Studies International and was recently named co-editor of the Transaction Publishers' Genocide, a critical biographic review. From 2007 to 2012, he served as the co-editor of the Genocide Studies and Prevention and was guest editor of the International Criminal Law Review special issue on Armenian genocide reparations and the Armenian Review special issue on new global reparation movements. Dr. Theriault is also the chair of the Armenian Genocide Reparations Study Group, which was assembled in 2007 by 4 experts in different areas of reparations theory and practice. Our third speaker, Dr. Jermaine McAlpin, is also part of this study group. And although I met him in person just yesterday, I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Theriault for the Armenian Weekly back in December about the group's work. While recognition of the Armenian genocide by the government of Turkey has been a priority for the Armenian community around the world, the notion of legal consequences that can emerge after recognition has generally been unaddressed and ignored. Although there have been several examples of valuable work treating the issue, none have approached the topic of reparations with the comprehensiveness and detailed analysis that is put forth by this group. And for that, we thank you, Dr. Theriault. Dr. Theriault's talk is entitled The Armenian Genocide, 2016 to 2025. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Henry Theriault.
Thank you very much. I'm truly grateful to be here this evening and wish to thank the sponsors of this event, starting with the Armenian National Committee of Canada, and especially Daron Kaskinian and Rupen Janbazian for making my visit possible, as well as the Yazidi Human Rights Organization International, Hillel of Greater Toronto, the Osgood International Law Society, the Sarah and Chaim Neuberger Holocaust Education Center, STAND, the Sarah Corning Center for Genocide Education, the U of T. You guys say U of T here, right? Is that right? Okay, good. I don't want to get that wrong. U of T, Armenian Student Association, the Amran Garo Association, and the Centennial Committee, to name almost all of them. And I got to talk to the organizers after to figure out how you were able to bring such a coalition together, because that's really very important in this work and very impressive. I want to single out the Syrian Chaldean Syriac Student Union for special mention for 2 reasons. First, I am deeply gratified that what was once treated as the Armenian genocide has now because of growing scholarship on the fates of Assyrian and Greek communities in Asia Minor, become recognized as the Ottoman genocide of Christian minorities. Second, while my expertise is largely limited to the Armenian case or aspect of this overarching genocidal process, and I'm very careful not to presume to speak uninvited about reparations claims from Assyrians or Greeks, and my focus tonight will be more on Armenian issues. I hope that soon there will begin joint work on the common issues facing the three groups, as each victim group and community and its allies among Turks and others strive to resolve the legacy of this genocidal process with justice. I am also deeply honored to present my very small contribution alongside two such impressive scholars, Drs. Fatima Müge-Gürçek and Jermaine McAlpin. Müge, you, every time I hear you or read your work, I learn something, and tonight is certainly no exception. You got me thinking and taking notes like crazy for a while. You have been an important and principled voice for 2 decades on the issue before us tonight, and fostered crucial advances in Armenian-Turkish dialogue and relations that, quite honestly, have pushed me far past my early tentativeness to embrace a range of Turkish interlocutors on genocide issues and well beyond them. You have taught us that a shared ethical commitment to human rights can provide the foundation for rich, trusting relationships in which Turks and Armenians are free to agree and disagree with one another as colleagues joined in a common endeavor. Indeed, through your leadership, new generations of Armenians and Turks have discovered that within our own communities and across what was once a divide, there is a healthy democratic divergence of ideas that are providing the tools for dramatic new advances in promotion of human rights. And Jermaine, I can never give enough thanks to the universe for the tremendous good fortune that befell me when I received your name from a colleague with an enthusiastic endorsement that I just had to have you present your work on transitional justice at the 2005 conference my university organized with the late Dennis Brutus on the emerging global reparations movement. There you presented the first iteration of your groundbreaking concept of a Truth and Rectification Commission. I was so impressed that 2 years later I invited you to be a founding member of the Armenian Genocide Reparations Study Group. Your work on transitional justice in that context has pushed me to overcome my great reluctance about truth commissions. Through your tutelage, I came to understand that a truth commission for the Armenian genocide not merely has potential to support the process, but is absolutely crucial to producing the full range of repairs necessary for the well-being of Armenians today and the rehabilitative transformation of Turkey. The report would be a shadow of its present form without your crucial and extensive role in the thinking behind and writing of it. And for those of you who don't know, on our 2010 trip to Armenia to present on the initial work of the study group, Jermaine became a minor celebrity with an appearance on television and a fan following, and I'm still looking for my 10% manager's fee for that. Finally, I want to thank each and every audience member. You have chosen to spend your time thinking about and discussing one of the most daunting sources of pain and difficult challenges of human existence. You have my deepest respect. I'm sorry to Rafe, and Müge mentioned this, although she didn't necessarily endorse this position, and many others who say this. There is an oft-repeated false truism about genocide, that denial is the final stage. It is so unquestionably accepted that it has even made its way into the formal stage theories people present on genocide. It is unfortunately quite wrong. Denial is not the final stage of genocide. And I think as Müge's tremendous work has shown, it is present throughout the genocidal process and in fact before the genocidal process. And that's true of many, many cases if you look carefully. For instance, Talat and his cronies were adamant that their violence against Armenians was not one-sided mass extermination, but instead a response to Armenian rebellion and violent perfidy in Van and elsewhere. They maintained that the deportations were intended to move Armenians to other areas of the empire, not a means of destroying the Armenian population village by village, town by town. We see variations on this theme in case after case. I'm being ironic here just in case I get quoted, misquoted, please. The United States did not hunt down Native American groups, did not kill those under their control or our control or force them onto destructive reservations. No, my country fought the so-called savages in a series of Indian wars. By the way, one need only look at the historical record of hyper-violence by the U.S. military and general population against Native Americans, which tortured, raped, killed, and then mutilated these populations to see who the real savages have been. The Tasmanians were killing livestock and even settlers, while the Herero were in revolt. The Jews had a world conspiracy out to get decent Aryans and needed to be stopped by the most brutal means possible. Pro-democracy activists in Indonesia were actually a communist insurgency, while Guatemalan Mayans, who appeared to be decent, hard-working people in dire poverty, just trying to survive the assaults on them by their government and their country's wealthy elite, were actually communists determined to destroy the good values of their society and impose a horrible political and social order. The Tutsis were hell-bent on destroying the Hutu, who had no choice but to respond, and the Bosnian Muslims, not the Serbs, were the aggressors, despite the fact that the latter had by far the most military power. Today, the supposed rebellion in the Nuba Mountain and Blue Nile regions of Sudan leave statesmen in quotes, Omar al-Bashir, no choice but to bomb tens of thousands of civilians with Antonov aircraft. I cannot help commenting at this moment about one of the speakers that who was brought to University of Toronto a few weeks ago, Bruce Fine. Anyone remember that? Okay. Who not only has a long history of claiming that the Armenian genocide did not happen, but if you go back, was actually a paid lobbyist for Omar al-Bashir's Sudan in the 1990s. I mean, at least he's consistent on genocide issues. Denial is not a stage of genocide, but part of the commission of genocide, especially as prosecutions have led sophisticated perpetrators to begin their international tribunal defenses while the blood is still flowing. Denial is certainly prevalent after genocide, as the false truism does capture correctly. It is not a final stage, however. Indeed, as long as denial persists, we can be sure that the genocidal process is still operating. Denial accomplishes this operation and furthers its goals of eliminating the consequences of the genocide for the perpetrator group, even generations and centuries after the violence and destruction. Denial is not the final stage of genocide. Consolidation of the genocide is. A genocide is consolidated after the phase of direct destruction, sometimes long after, when the perpetrator group has made final all the various demographic, political, identity, military, cultural, material, symbolic, financial, and territorial gains made through the genocide. When the post-genocide state of affairs has become completely, utterly, irredeemably permanent, so that whether the victim group has faded out of existence, as many do, or still persists, as some that we've discussed tonight do, their condition will remain as it is, in the enduring position of victimhood, unredeemed and unrepaired. Denial, geopolitically motivated treaties, and other forces all conspire with the passage of time in the process of consolidation. What is striking about consolidation is that no matter how much complex forces can be blamed for the direct phase of a genocide and leave room for repentance by the perpetrator group, consolidation is done with a full understanding of what was done in the genocide and the moral obligation to repair it that genocide has imposed, and in deliberate rejection by the majority of the perpetrator group, not all, but the majority, of somehow doing right by the victims. A genocide deeply ruptures the pre-existing status quo and in particular devastates the victim community. Just because the violence and destruction of a genocide end does not mean that the consequences are mitigated. On the contrary, so long as the impact of a genocide on its victims remains unrepaired, that impact continues devastating them in perpetuity. Despite the wishful thinking of philosophers such as Jeremy Waldron, and as Germain, and I thought I was going after him, as Germain will, I think, emphasize later on, and as Rafi also talked about, time does not heal the wounds of genocide. On the contrary, as generation follows generation, more and more people are injured, demeaned, and assaulted by the direct original violence. With each day that passes without repair, the scope of destruction increases. The end limit point of this process is not the success of denial, but the point at which denial is no longer necessary because the genocide's impact has become fully irreparable, as the genocide's consequences have become permanently consolidated in the global social, political, and economic status quo. Genocides are denied because their effects, both material and in terms of historical memory, are thankfully still contested. This is evident through a few examples. The genocides of the Herero, Australian Aborigines, Native Canadians, and Native Americans are still denied actively, precisely because the victim groups still experience the impacts of the injuries of direct massacre, religious and cultural destruction, internment on reservations, family degradation through boarding schools, and other forced transfers of children from their home groups, and much more. And so a reparative process could actually address these harms. Denial stops reparations. Denial of the Holocaust continues because the evils of anti-Semitism that it maximized horrifically remain vibrant forces in human society across the globe. The Holocaust persists through its legacy of making Jews, already long before considered fit targets of oppression and violence, the fit targets of mass extermination. Denials of the Bangladesh, East Timor, Cambodia, and other cases continue because perpetrators and survivors still live, and the deep harm done to each of these societies remains largely unaddressed. The list of these kinds of cases goes on. In contrast, no one denies the genocides of Melos or Carthage in the ancient world, of the Cathars, or the genocides by Genghis Khan, because the destruction they imparted into the world has long since been completely and irreparably incorporated into the world order. For these and all too many other genocides, completely and utterly getting away with it has been the final stage. How many so-called great societies and states celebrated in the present and in the past are so because of their great success in consolidating the genocides they committed? The false truism reflects an important effect of denial. Years of denial after a genocide actually skew the framework through which that genocide is perceived and understood. Faced with a strong denial campaign, survivors and concerned others, including in the perpetrator group, find themselves in seemingly endless, disheartening, degrading, and exhausting struggle simply to get the truth recognized by enough people so that it will not be erased from the annals of human history. Soon enough, the genocide is lost in the struggle against denial, which becomes an end in itself. The defeat of denial under such circumstances comes to be seen as justice for the genocide. Defeated or not, denial wins the day by preventing us from seeing that the defeat of denial does not give us justice, but merely gets us back to the starting point from which we can finally initiate a justice process. For long past genocides, victim groups and others forget the recognition of the genocide against denial, forget that recognition of the genocide against denial does not repair the harms done by the genocide, but merely addresses a secondary problem. With this in mind, it is clear that 2015, the 100th anniversary of the Armenian case, should not be understood as a culminating point in the post-genocide history of the Ottoman genocide of Christian minority groups. If recognition comes this year, as it could, although I'm not holding my breath, it may mean only that finally, after a century, the victim groups and others concerned with human rights can finally start addressing the harms done. But the effects of genocide are not measured in such neat little packages of 10 years, 50 years, or 100 years, which we make special, after all, simply because of the evolutionary accident that has given us 10 fingers to count with. As much as some people, especially those outside of victim communities, who need a good story before they are willing to care about the legacy of mass violence, attach significance to such time intervals, the consequences of genocide play out in a complex history of material and social causal chains, so that no particular year or date has any great actual meaning. Or, to put it more correctly, every year and every day in the long aftermath of a genocide have great importance until the injuries are addressed in a substantial way that is appropriately transformative for both the victim and perpetrator groups. What are the harms when it comes to the Armenian genocide? It's good for us to remind ourselves about these. My work is focused on the Armenian case, and if you'll permit me a short commercial interruption, just to mention the reparations report that you've heard about already. You can access the executive summary and introduction already. It's at, we can project this maybe sometime, www.armeniangenocidereparations.info. And our full 90,000 word report is currently being typeset for electronic and print distribution in English and Armenian and should be up on the website very shortly. The harms done by the Armenian genocide are very much present today. This is something we have to always recognize in each case of genocide. They include the dramatic demographic impact on the Armenian population through direct and indirect killing, as well as forced assimilation that reduced the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire to less than 40% of its pre-genocide number, but also the compounding impact on birth rates and retention of members by rape and other torture, rampant poverty, long-term effects of malnutrition, global dispersion, loss of religious, educational, and other institutions necessary for the cohesion of Armenian communities, and much more. To these harms are added the extensive lost property of Armenians. Not only were virtually all land, businesses, farms, warehouse inventories, food stocks, and other such properties taken from Armenians, but the mass expropriation reached down to the most trivial items, from kitchen pots and pans to the clothes on deportees' backs and the shoes on their feet. Turkish activist and writer Temel Demirer has stated that this mass theft of Armenian property was the basis of the entire economy of the new 1923 Turkish Republic when it was founded, and intentionally so. What is more, since this time, Armenians have lost all that would have been built on this, which compounds daily, with many living out their lives over the past century, impoverished because denied what was theirs. And this mass of material resources has not just disappeared. Wealthy Turkish families, the government, and even average people have received the cumulative benefits of all this wealth, which has allowed them to build and daily compound more. In fact, scholars such as Ugur Ungur and Mehmet Politel have traced expropriated Armenian property right through to contemporary national and regional elite families, some of whose fortunes were built with the property directly pilfered from exterminated Armenians. The destruction of religious, cultural, educational, artistic, and other aspects of Armenian communal existence, coupled with the demographic collapse and global dispersion, have rendered Armenian identity and peoplehood fragile, requiring continual draining efforts by members of the community just to prevent its erasure. The demographic destruction and individual as well as state territorial expropriations of the 1915 to 23 period are the most important factor in the fact that today's Armenian Republic is a small, landlocked country of barely 3 million people, facing a gigantic, economically and militarily powerful and hostile Turkey of 70 million. A Turkey that enjoys tremendous regional power and geopolitical prominence that allows it nearly free reign in its treatment of the Armenian Republic. Even had the genocide occurred, but Ataturk's ultra-nationalist forces not invaded and conquered the bulk of the 1918 Armenian Republic, historian Richard Hovhanessian has estimated that the Republic today would be a much larger and much more secure state with a population on the order of 20 million. What would it mean for such an Armenia to face a territorially and demographically smaller Turkey today? Surely Armenians in the Republic and around the world would be infinitely more secure and enjoy a level of community well-being that became a fantasy on April 24, 1915. Armenians in Turkey have borne a great share of the genocide's impact. After almost a century of suffering and relative silence, the legacy of oppression and violence is now well known through Muget's and others' very important work. Reflecting on Native Americans in the United States, Mayans in Guatemala, survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and other such groups, I have often thought that the most difficult situation a victim group or individual can ever find itself, himself, or herself in, even beyond the terrible situation of all victims, is to remain subject to the perpetrator group or individual. Far beyond the painful, demeaning effects of denial for a group that has escaped, the situation of those still under perpetrator power is to be constantly forced to live within the world of violence and power of the original harm, feeling always on the edge of being pushed back into violence, with no escape from the terror and no space simply to mourn what happened. And perpetrator groups and individuals seem never content even with that level of continuing harm to their victims, but as we have seen with Turkey and many, many other perpetrator societies, continue with such things as repression of non-Muslim minority foundations and expropriation of their property, which we know from the work of brave Turkish writer and activist Sayet Çetenoglu and others, and of course the assassination of Hrant Dink, which we've also discussed tonight. Reparations for the Armenian genocide are certainly legally, historically, morally, and politically justified in abstract terms. But as the Armenian Republic struggles economically and politically, the Armenian diaspora expends greater and greater energy to be less and less effective in preserving an Armenian identity, and Armenians in Turkey to continue to live under threat and oppression. Reparations are an absolute need if the Republic, diaspora, and Turkish Armenian community have any future at all. And the 1915 genocide is not to succeed by 2065. For the current trends make it a real possibility that the state will fail in the next half century, that the Armenian Turkish community will become a perpetually subjugated group with no hope of true participation as full citizens in their state and society, and Armenian identity will become a residual and decaying after effect of genocide, rather than a vibrant, living community anchor that it should be. The full history of the Armenian genocide is far from written. I do not have time tonight to discuss in detail the reparations proposal made in the study group's final report, but I do want to address certain objections that often prevent such work from being taken seriously. As I think Jermaine will talk about, and Rafi already has, another false truism is that time heals all wounds. Nothing could be more wrong. Unless we mean by healing that perpetrator groups and the world in general eventually can forget that a genocide happened and the victim group will eventually fade away. Unless the harms of a genocide are addressed, they persist and in fact compound over time. If time is running out, it is running out for perpetrator groups. As Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks join what I am calling the 100-plus club of groups whose experience of destruction has endured more than a century, and unfortunately there are quite a few of those members. It is Turkey that should regard the sands flowing down in the hourglass with foreboding and disquiet. As time passes, harms become more difficult to repair, and those, many in the victim communities who have lived and died without justice, can never receive it. Already Japan is on the verge of failing utterly to repair in any small way all the harms done to the comfort women, the women who were actually mostly underage girls who were pressed into sexual slavery by the Japanese military government between the years of 1931 and 1945. These girls and women were interned in hellish stations and raped sometimes 30 times a day, 6 days a week, for months and even years. Many died, but those who survived have for a quarter century demanded an apology and meaningful atonement through material reparations, which have become necessary because their physical and health conditions are so bad and their poverty so great from the stigmatization that they were subjected to when they tried to return home to their home communities around Asia, that in their old age they live in a horrible situation. Japan has refused and denied, and now many former comfort women have passed on. Japan has already lost the opportunity with them, and as a state and society must bear the taint of this terrible human rights abuse as long as that state continues to exist. And once the last former comfort woman is gone, the taint will be complete. Turkey and other such perpetrators have the benefit that ethnic, national, racial, and religious groups, if they survive annihilation, have identity cohesion over time. And so as long as genocide does not succeed completely, there is always a group that can receive the benefits of repair. Even though they've lost the opportunity for those Armenians no longer with us, and they've lost the possibility of dealing over the past century, there's still time to make meaningful efforts at repair. Second, even setting aside the legal status of Turkey as the Ottoman Empire's continuing state and Turkish Republican forces' perpetration of the second phase of the Armenian genocide from 1919 to 23, Turks today do bear responsibility for addressing the harms of the genocide. And to echo Muge's point, they are in no way to blame for it, even when they deny it as a separate issue. But as their state and society continue to hold the gains made and benefit from them, and as Armenians continue to suffer from the harms that I've discussed, today's Turks have an obligation to make repair as much as they possibly can. Of course, nothing approaching full repair is possible. You cannot bring back the dead and so forth. But repair is possible. It only requires the political and ethical will to make it. And making repair is not unfair to present-day Turks. It is unfair if there is a burden. Its unfairness comes from the imposition by the perpetrators of the genocide, who have in essence damned Turks today to deal with the history and the problems that they created. Whatever burden contemporary Turks take on will be just a pale and small fraction of the burden that Armenians, Assyrians, Greeks have to bear as a result of the genocide. And taking on that small share, even with the greatest reparations package imaginable, is an act of good faith that can help restore the connection between the communities. Reparations is about sacrifice. If reparations were easy, every group that had committed mass violence would make it. But for today's Turks, making that sacrifice is the only path toward really resolving the Armenian genocide issue for themselves and for Armenians. Another objection is that the quest for reparations, particularly territorial, is a hopeless pipe dream kept alive by deluded so-called Armenian nationalists who refuse to live in reality. Realpolitik is the dominant ethic of international relations and leaves no room for moral imperatives toward repair. This is something that perpetrators always tell victim groups, again and again and again. Slave owners were telling it to abolitionists and African slaves and freed Africans in the 1850s in the United States. People were telling it to Gandhi in 1935. People were telling it to Martin Luther King and Malcolm X in 1955. Thankfully, none of them believed it. They struggled and persevered and ended up changing the world. There's no reason that the Armenian genocide can't be resolved. The solution is not that complicated. And it's only if Armenians and others, and their allies among the Turkish population and other groups, give up that it won't happen. I just want to conclude with a much broader appeal. When we talk about reparations, typically people think typically in terms of their own group only, which I think is a mistake. The process that destroyed Armenian and other communities in Asia Minor is the same process that has faced other groups as well. But it's also tied into issues of colonialism, slavery, apartheid, mass rape, economic exploitation, and military aggression. As we heard from other representatives of other groups tonight, the first step we can take is to understand that we have solidarity across groups. We face the same issues, not just in terms of denial, but in terms of the victimization and the impact of destruction. But it's deeper than that. I would go so far as to argue, just as a group as group reparations are really the key, rather than individual reparations within a group, okay, that we have to start thinking of a global reparations process. The world we have, the world that's given to us, Canada, the United States, you can't look anywhere in the world and not see that this world order was created by all these forces I just mentioned. Our world has been made through genocide and other forms of destruction and oppression. And the only way that we're going to change that is to start to address the impact of these destructions through a reparative process. For me, reparations is not about individual groups getting some compensation for what happened in the past or anything like that. That's important, it's needed, but it's about a dramatic social transformation to try to reverse the past 500 years of mass destruction and oppression that has given us this, I have to say, rather awful world for so many victim groups. And if you have any questions about this, just look at the situation of Native Canadians, Native Americans, and others, and you'll see very clearly that this destruction is still there. this kind of undertaking is a lot bigger challenge than talking about recognition for a genocide, than talking about individual lawsuits and claims and things like that. But it's really the undertaking we have to join together to make. And I hope, if I've done anything tonight, besides make you have to sit in your chairs for longer than you would have liked to hear me, that I've conveyed that very important idea. Thank you very much for your time.
Dr. Jermaine McAlpin is currently Associate Director of the Center for Caribbean Thought and Lecturer of Transitional Justice in the Department of Government, University of West Indies, Mona. He received his Bachelor of Science in Political Science and International Relations and his Master's from the University of West Indies, Mona. He earned his MA and PhD in Political Science from Brown University. Dr. McAlpin specializes in African political philosophy, Caribbean political thought, and transitional justice. His research interests include truth commissions, commissions of inquiry and political accountability, reparations for historic injustice such as slavery, Native American and Armenian genocides. Dr. McAlpin has written on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its development of a restorative justice approach to South Africa's transitional justice issues, as well as the moral justification for reparations for slavery and the Armenian genocide. His most recent publications have been on the Grenadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the Journal of Social and Economic Studies in September 2013, Reparations for Slavery in the Americas in the Armenian Review, spring 2013, and on the Haitian Truth Commission in the Global South, spring 2012. In 2011, he was lead author on a UNDP-sponsored study on governance and truth, telling mechanisms in Jamaica, entitled No Truth, No Trust, Democracy, Governance, and the Prospects of Truth-Telling Mechanisms in Jamaica. As I mentioned earlier, Dr. McAlpin is a part of the Armenian Genocide Reparations Study Group. In September 2014, the group completed its final report entitled Resolution with Justice, Reparations for the Armenian Genocide, a wide-ranging analysis of the legal, historical, political, and ethical dimensions of the question of reparations for the genocide. Dr. McAlpin's talk is entitled Reparations and Genocides. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Jermaine McAlpin.
Thank you very much. Let me just answer the question that most of you have. What is a Jamaican doing studying the Armenian genocide? My first memory of the Armenian genocide was when I was in elementary school in Jamaica. My sister had a history book, and I read of a place I couldn't find on the map called Nagorno-Karabakh. And that was 1986. And then, as fate would have it, here I am, almost 30 years later, talking to you about the Armenian genocide. Why is this important? History makes a full circle, and I want to talk to you today about genocide and reparations. What do I want to talk about? There are a few things that I want to make clear. We often think of genocides as aberrations. They are something that just happen, but I want to talk about genocides in a different way. Genocides can be thought of as extreme nation-building projects. Almost all genocides could be understood in that way. It is an opportunity to get rid of one population that does not fit the image of the nation state. So they are extreme nationalism projects. Genocides create dichotomies. That is, they configure or reconfigure people into groups. Either you are belonging or you are not belonging. Genocidal acts are perpetrated, strangely, to provide a solution to the ever-present problem of multiculturalism. Why? Because the nation state can only be interpreted in the minds of a few. Genocides are not aberrations. They are rational calculations by those in power to categorize groups in what Umit Ungor calls organizing oblivion. That is, removing people from history. That is what genocides attempt to do. In another way, committing genocide is ultimately aimed at organizing amnesia, wiping these people from the face of the earth. All modern genocides have started with a march. Africans were marched from the interior of West Africa to the shores. Native Americans were forced on the Trail of Tears. And the first genocide of the 20th century, the Herero Namokwa in Namibia, were marched into the desert in 1905. The Armenians through the Syrian desert in 1914 and 15. The Jews in Nazi Germany being forced marched to gas chambers. Hutus and Tutsis being marched into churches to be slaughtered. And the many persons in Darfur who were marched into torture, rape, death, and expulsion. They start with a march and they end with denial. Almost all perpetrator groups deny that something happened. Genocides ought not to be excused as the mercurial wishes of madmen. Note well, there have been no female leaders that have perpetrated genocides. That is an interesting talk for another lecture. But it is worth noting that women and children make up roughly 60% of the victims of genocide. What a different world it would be if we had more women world leaders. You see, denial is not new. Denial is the oldest profession, even older than prostitution. You see, what is important is that we understand that when you deny something, you are, in effect, telling yourself it never happened. And you also do something else. You are rewriting memory. You know, it's like that memory card. You can delete everything that's on it, and you can rewrite it or reformat it. But genocides do not go away. They can't be suppressed. Why? Because they live on in our collective memory. What I want to talk about is amnesia as a form of injustice. Amnesia isn't just forgetfulness. It is an injustice that is induced by power. Those who have the power to tell history, we are told, they determine the course of action. In the case of the Armenian genocide, forgetfulness, or what I call amnesia-induced injustice, is based on this notion of what we call collective amnesia. No genocide happened, and therefore we never had any problems with Armenians being Turk, unless it was on our terms. According to Asia Hur, policies were implemented to erase what was done to the Armenians from the collective memory. At first, this act of forgetting was a precondition for Turkish identity. In time, it became an element of its continuation. According to Asia Gunaisu, people who have fallen victim to genocide are killed twice. First, by a weapon, second, by the denial of truth. A genocide is more of a genocide when you are not only condemned to death, but also condemned to be non-existent. It is because of this why denial is a continuation of extermination. Genocide concealment is always in the interest of the perpetrators. Even when the pervasive facts are there, those in power are inclined to deny genocide. When perpetrators are brought to acceptance that a genocide happened, it is to accept that society always has within itself a strain of its own destruction. Why? When we look at the world in which we live, genocides remind us that radical evil has stamped its imprint on our world time and time again. The genocides of the 20th and 21st century have claimed over 25 million lives. Of that, the Armenian genocide accounts for between 1.5 and 2 million deaths. However, it is not the numbers of persons killed that should prompt us to do something about genocides. It is that those who perpetrate them are intent on getting away with the crimes. I want to make an argument that when a genocide is committed, it leaves a debt, and the perpetrator group has that outstanding bill to pay. Reparation is therefore not to be understood as an escape clause out of historic injustice. It must be understood as the mechanism for resolving historic injustice. You see, as Henry and several others have said over the last couple of weeks, we are too caught up with our own suffering within our own groups to broaden our worldview that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. In other words, the Armenian genocide is not just the business of Armenians. Just as the genocidal acts against Native Americans and Africans, Jews, Cambodians, Darfurians, and countless others is not just the business of members of those groups. We do too much moral gymnastics, especially concerning genocides. They have become commonplace and may continue to be so until we put some weight behind this nice-sounding cliche, never again. While words are powerful, words alone cannot stop genocides. Genocides require collective action, collective condemnation, and collective identification. Reparation is ultimately the only palliative for historic injustice. When someone denies the harm that is done to you, it intensifies both victimhood as well as acrimony. The issue with Armenian genocide and all other genocides is not a question of truth versus lies, it is truth versus denialism. It is not that the truth doesn't exist, it's that it is denied. But what truth are we talking about? I do research on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they itemized 4 types of truths. And I argue that the Armenian genocide meets all criteria, all 4 criteria. 4 types of truth. Forensic or factual truth. We have enough historical record to determine what happened, to whom it happened, when, where, how, and who was involved. There is no denial of forensic or factual truth. The evidence is clear. The second truth is narrative truth. We have enough personal recollection and memory already stored within the annals of our minds collectively that genocide occurred. It would mean that hundreds of thousands of Armenians, Assyrians, Greeks, and all of us across the world have lived in the Elysian fields. No genocide happened. The third type of truth is social truth. People have spoken from their own experiences. The fourth truth is ultimately what we want to get to, but it requires an intervention. The fourth truth is reconciliatory or healing truth. That truth is most important, but it is also most public. We aren't there as yet. Why? Because while truth is important to justice, we cannot get to reconciliation without justice. And the South African experience has guaranteed to us that the telling of truth does not lead ultimately or inevitably to reconciliation. You can't get to reconciliation when you still have my possessions, you fly them in my face, you remind me that they are mine. Obviously I loaned them to you and forgot to take them back. Or maybe more retrograde, you remind me that they are yours, but by some slate of history they are now mine, and so they were never yours to begin with. It is reparations that gets us to justice. And according to Mari Matsuda, there are 3 criteria for the granting of reparations. And again, the Armenian genocide and all the genocides we've been talking about satisfy all 3 criteria. The first is that the injustice must be well documented. Tomes of books have been written, many ink has been spilled. The Armenian genocide is not an historical invention, it is fact. The second, the victims were a distinct group. It wasn't the case that massive numbers of Turks were killed in the nation-building project. Yes, Turks were killed, but a distinct and clearly identified group was slaughtered. And finally, there must be evidence that this clearly identified group continues to suffer harm. Now that is critical because we think of harm only as it relates to the immediate survivors of genocide. All of us have been legacyzed the injustices of those who suffered under genocide. So even if we ourselves were neither perpetrators nor immediate victims, we continue through history to bear the evidence of genocide. I think reparations, if properly constituted, provides an opportunity for the past as well as the present. Again, I take reparations not just to be monetary compensation, but reparations must be more comprehensive than just money. And it is not that we can't moralize the granting of money. Reparations has to be wider than money because it wasn't just monetary or economic loss that Armenians suffered. They have suffered psychologically, historically, socially, culturally, and otherwise. I want us to think of reparations as an act of restoration. Reparations are designed to set things straight or to give satisfaction or redress from an injury. Just as the committing of genocide was not a single act, reparation is not just a single act. I believe there are 6 dimensions of reparation. And I argue that we can't understand reparation fulsomely without understanding the 6 dimensions of reparation. The first and most obvious is recognition. The first dimension of reparation has to be recognition. You have to recognize, that is to acknowledge that a historic injustice was done. To recognize means to say, I acknowledge that genocide occurred. To recognize does another thing, and that is it humanizes. When you recognize, you are making the other person fully human. You cannot talk about reparation without rehumanizing both the victims as well as their descendants. But I argue and I offer to you that recognition is incomplete without the other dimensions of reparation. You can recognize all you want, but what will you do about what you've recognized? Many persons recognize things. I refer to the African American discussion on slavery and reparations, and I think of the Caribbean experience with slavery. One British Prime Minister issued a statement of regret. He was regretful that slavery occurred. We can regret all the things in history we want, but that does not satisfy the condition of recognition. You regret being late for this talk, but it's a different matter to recognize that you should have been early. The second dimension is reclamation. Part of genocides is that they take a lot from the people who suffer, and they continue to take from their descendants. When you do reclamation, you are saying what has been taken we cannot return in kind in terms of restitution, but we can ensure that these groups can reclaim. Why is it important to reclaim? There's a psychological dimension to genocide that is not often discussed, and that is the collective identity of a particular group has been destroyed or shattered. And so reparation provides the opportunity for reclamation, that this group can rescue themselves from oblivion. The third dimension is replacement. There are things that must be replaced. The concern, again, is not analogous replacement. It is about ensuring that the genocide is finally expunged. If you do not replace the injustice with justice, the genocide continues to flourish. So we continue to say 100 years since the Armenian genocide. I say 100 years of the Armenian genocide. Why? Because if a genocide has not been properly repaired, it continues to flourish. The fourth dimension of reparation is redemption. At the heart of reparation is this notion of redemption. But what or who is being redeemed? Interestingly, this is the stage or the dimension of reparation that involves both victims as well as perpetrators. It is important that we understand that in redemption, both the victim group and perpetrators need redemption. In other words, the ignominy of genocidal acts perpetrated by the forebears of Turks must also be understood as part of the cycle of suffering. According to Martha Minow, when we grant reparation, we break the cycle of hatred and violence. In other words, reparation provides an opportunity for the perpetrator group to rid themselves of the stain of genocidal criminality. You can't be rid of that stain unless you get to reparation. And again, I want to caution you lest you think I'm saying reparation requires the granting of hush money. We'll never be silent about genocidal acts, and the granting of compensation does not erase the pain, but what it does is what we call an aspirational act, and that is an act geared towards restoring something that ultimately is metaphysical. The fifth dimension is rectification. There has to be some adjustment, and Henry already touched on it, this notion that the sequestering of properties owned by the Turkish government and returned to the rightful owners would be a contemporary injustice is not only unproblematic, it is false. Because if there is enough evidence to declare and to determine that those properties were previously held and owned by groups that suffered genocide, rectification calls for an adjustment of these things. The return of churches, the return of names, because again, a genocide is so pervasive because it removes one from history. Names were changed, and when names are changed, identities are changed. South Africa had to go through that same process of renaming many of the apartheid era streets and cities by renaming them one of the 11 ethnic groups in South Africa. The final dimension is rehabilitation. Every genocidal act requires rehabilitation, both of the perpetrator as well as the victim. It doesn't matter how long ago the genocide occurred, rehabilitation is required. Why? We cannot put a statute of limitations on suffering. Until the victim undergoes a re-establishment of its suffering and the contribution that they've made to the country from which they've been exodused, there is no rehabilitation. Until the perpetrator group sheds the label of being a genocidal group, we cannot speak of reparation in a comprehensive manner. Rehabilitation is necessary if the reputation of the victim group is to be restored, because genocides also damage the reputation of the victim group. It says to everyone else that these people cause these acts on themselves. And the classic modern case of this was the Rwandan genocide. The Hutus alleged that the Tutsis would have killed them, so it was a preemptive strike. It was an attempt to protect the homeland. And that is why I started off by saying all genocides are extreme nation-building projects. The nation must be configured in the interest of only one group. And I'm very encouraged to see that this audience has many persons under 30, of which I feel very old. Because it is important that the youths are a part of this discussion. They are the torchbearers, and they have to carry on where many of us cannot and could not carry on. It is important that we do not stop just with the elders, but we continue with the youths. Now, I want to conclude with a few objections about reparation. I've elsewhere said that reparation is not hush money. It is not an effort to keep the victim group quiet. So pay them off so they can stop whining about genocide. Reparation is not hush money. It is not to be granted to pay off anyone. The only justification for reparation is that a victim group suffered historic injustice. It is not charity. Reparation is not charity. It's not an attempt to shed your conscience or to demonstrate your moral benevolence. It is what is required by justice. Reparation is a debt, one which has not been paid, not because the debtor isn't aware of the debt, but the presumption is if you ignore the debt, it will go away. Genocides, as I said, never go away. Descendants never forget. I remember going to South Africa and seeing discussions about the Truth Commission, and the lady had up a placard and it says, "We do not have amnesia, we will not forget." Amnesia is the elixir that deniers want to feed us. If they give us amnesia, we'll all together imbibe on it and say nothing happened. Time cannot erase the debt. Denial cannot erase the debt. What often gets us to actually pay down the debt that we have is the threat of sanctions. You will be listed as credit unworthy if you have credit card debt. You can deny that you owe it, but the bank has something else to say. Truth is not just a good thing, it is a necessary thing, and that is the common ground that all of us must stand on. Whether we are Jews, Armenians, Assyrians, whomever we are, truth is the side on which we must stand, because history will judge us if we know the truth and do nothing about it. The fact that nothing can undo the damage and the loss of genocides is not the same as saying we should not repair them. And I want to end with this notion that it is important to apologize for historic wrongs, but being remorseful or regretful is only the beginning. It is more than just admitting that a wrong was done. It is doing something about the wrong. According to Hegel, until a crime is punished, it continues to flourish. We must have memorializations and commemorations, days of remembrances, so that we can collectively put the past in its proper place, because the past can never be put to rest. In this summary removal of Armenians from the Turkish territory and also its civilization and culture requires a rewriting of history. And ultimately, what I find most disheartening is this notion that we have to focus only on our own suffering. And I came upon the Mexican proverb made popular during the Zapatista movement in the mid-20th century. And it says, "They tried to bury us, but they did not know we were seeds." A seed has to die first before it brings forth life. We have to more than memorialize those who have suffered through genocide. We have to repair the past on their behalf. Genocide recognition is not for the faint-hearted. We owe it. Not only do perpetrators have a debt, we present generations have a debt. We owe it to past generations, many of who didn't know why they were killed. They were killed just by virtue of belonging to a group. No other identity required, just by virtue of association. I argue that they've transferred their injustice to us, and we bear the mark of this injustice. Reparation is a debt that is owed. No cancellation of this debt occurs without atonement or reparation. I close with an Ewemina proverb from Benin in West Africa, and it says, "Until the lion gets his own storyteller, the story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." Thank you very much.